This is HighIntensityBusiness.com with Lawrence Neal, helping you achieve your health and fitness goals. Become a great personal trainer and build your high-intensity strength training business.
Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to HighIntensityBusiness.com. This is episode 235. Today's guest is Skyler Tanner. Skyler is an exercise physiologist and founder of Smart Strength, a fast-growing, high-intensity personal training business based in Austin, Texas. Skyler, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you so much. 235 episodes. That's great.
Yeah,
it's really fantastic.
Yeah, it's nuts, isn't it?
It is. It is nuts.
It's funny because I think that's a big number, but then I see Joe Rogan. I think he's on episode 1400 and something. And I follow.
But Joe, he started in 2009. I mean, he was practically mailing people tapes of his podcast. How early he started.
yeah, he's been going a long time. So how are things with you? How's business? Give us a quick update on things.
So the quick update. So on the professional side, as I talk to you right now, we have one payment left to pay off the business loan.
Wow. Congrats.
Yeah, that was a 3-year note and an aggressive repayment schedule. And, when you're in the throes of the sort of the entrepreneurial stressors where you don't have quite enough clients and the revenue you want, and you're too far away, you're between shores, right? I would have thought that this moment coming into it was going to be like a giant relief, a huge exhalation, Shawshank Redemption, on my knees, screaming in the rain kind of thing. But my concern is that it's going to be very Bill Belichickian, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing. And I'm working very hard to savor the hard work that has been done and the lessons learned along the way, and give myself a little credit and my wife and everybody involved. Because if my tendency will be to skip right past that sort of closing emotional state to just knock off the next debt, because year 4 of this whole endeavor will be paying off the proxy debt, the credit card debt that was taken on, the short-term lines of credit. But those have some flex, right? It's not $3,300 a month every single month or else. And as they get paid off, you have more capital, you have more liquid, right? So it's kind of cool how it's going to all roll downhill faster and faster from here. But yeah, it's feeling pretty good, man.
Yeah, well done. That's awesome. And I totally agree. Didn't you have something planned, like a dinner with all of the people that helped out? Yes,
it's going, the people so the business was crowdfunded. And we talked about that in an earlier podcast where it was a Hail Mary of sorts, and it's amazing that it worked out. So I was going to take everybody who invested in the business out to there's a restaurant here in town that, almost like the really high-end sushi places where you could just do almost an unlimited, eat until you're full, but it's high-end sushi. There's a place like that here where it's an unlimited tasting menu. So as long as you're not leaving food on the plate, you can, order more fried Brussels sprouts, and they're not, for a fixed price. And so it's a really great experience. We really like going there. And so we're going to take our clients out and really kind of celebrate that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really, really important, like you say, and take a moment to just really savor that achievement. And I'll take a moment to say that one of the cool things about the podcast is it's almost like these podcasts we've done are like a series, and people can see your business evolve over time. Because each podcast is like a checkpoint, and so if people want to learn about the history of Smart Strength, then I will certainly put the links to the other podcasts in the show notes. So in this podcast, we wanted to, I reached out to you and said, there's all this confusion about high intensity training and cardiovascular health and the rush factor. And I think there needs to be some, that being said, Simon and you have already done a wonderful article on this, and Simon's done another article with James Steele where I think he really covers these things well. But there are some people that just prefer to listen to a podcast. And so I see no harm in treading over some of the same ground, but trying to focus more on the rush factor aspect, because I think it's useful for those listening who are trying to articulate to their clients, okay, yes, I understand we're not doing quote unquote cardio, but we are, and this is how. and also, whether or not they implement things like the rush factor in their programming. So I think it's going to be very, very helpful. And personally, I'm super interested for my own training and for also when I'm training clients. So I figured as a starting point, just to kind of set the scene for people, can you just, I guess we would try and get through this relatively quickly and I'll let you kind of gauge that. But could you just sort of go through how exactly high intensity training helps improve the cardiovascular system?
Okay. Big question. So let me step back and say that when we're talking about exercise of any sort, you have multiple variables in place. That it's like a multi-armed bandit. The term the one-armed bandit refers to a slot machine. The multi-armed bandit, in this case, we're talking about if you imagine pulling one lever to try to bias, each lever represents something else or something different. You pull one lever and it biases you towards, strength or endurance, towards this, towards that. And it's a bias. It's not as we'll get into it, a biasing towards a specific energy system or a specific task does not abandon everything else that you might be able to train. For example, when we talk about the classic dichotomy of aerobic versus anaerobic exercise, the reality is that all of your energy systems are running concurrently to a varying degree, and what you're managing is the severity of the load on one or more energy systems relative to a lower or higher intensity. So you're never omitting, if you go to muscular fatigue or maximum effort, you have recruited all the fibers possible. There was nothing left in the tank. There was everything was sufficiently taxed. Then when you're playing with intensities with aerobic conditioning or anaerobic conditioning, everything is working to some degree and getting some benefit with priority placed on one of those potential energy systems. So when we talk about that with moving then towards resistance training versus kind of steady state aerobic activity or even high intensity interval training, as James talks about, and there's no such thing as cardio, and then he and that Fisher and Steele have demonstrated with a number of recent studies looking at matching time to task fatigue on a cycle ergometer versus a leg press. You can the intensity of the effort drives the kind of adaptation. So the people who are doing a leg press to fatigue, and I think it was 60 seconds or maybe 90 seconds, and the people who were doing a cycle ergometer to fatigue, and fatigue in this case was, I think if I recall correctly, measured by the inability to maintain a given RPM at a certain load on the bike. Because when you have a cycle ergometer, you can create resistance, you can set the resistance, and when you could no longer maintain a specific RPM, you've effectively failed. And they had similar outcomes. They had both similar acute. They had similar outcomes, and I think it was an acute. There may have been a strength assessment, so it may have been chronic. It may have been two separate studies, but the last one I was looking at was looking at the acute effects of blood pressure changes, perceived exertion, and a variety of other things. So, and anybody who's seen like sprint cyclists know that they have reasonably muscular legs because it's really hard work. And gears are resistance. So if you're using resistance to reach fatigue in a given amount of time, you could theoretically get on a leg press and make the weight really light and do repetitions for 45 minutes. And I bet you would have similar cardiovascular outcomes as if you went and ran for 45 minutes at your 45-minute maximum pace. So nobody will want to do that. It would be incredibly boring. But for the sake of argument, it would be similar. The weight is light enough to do a sufficient number of repetitions in a duration that requires a relatively slower metabolism, the aerobic system, to dominate, to supply that energy, versus the anaerobic system, which once you're using anaerobic system, it's like a lit fuse, and you don't have a lot of time before you're going to have to drop the intensity back, or you're going to have to stop the task entirely. So that is, they have demonstrated that, and I suspect there will be follow-on studies that further demonstrate that. Actually, high-intensity training, sprint interval training has been demonstrated to improve 1-rep max leg press because it's really, really hard if you're going as hard as you possibly can. It's a very high intensity. And so when you talk about the type of people we tend to see, the CEO, supermom, retiree, fairly deconditioned individual, coming into this space, doing a lot of muscular work is going to improve cardiovascular function. That's seen in the cardiac rehab literature, and that's seen in the untrained but not sick literature as well. People improve their cardiovascular endurance. They improve their efficiency. So, tasks of daily living result in a lower intensity of effort, both on a perceived exertion basis, but also if they strap on a heart rate monitor, which is imperfect for a variety of reasons, which we might get into, then you're seeing a lower change in heart rate from resting to while they're engaging in the task. And you're also seeing sort of a greater cardiovascular volume. As people get stronger, they tend to do more stuff at a lower intensity because it's easier to do. So they're accumulating benefits that way as well.
Awesome. Do you want to just talk about the some of the mechanisms that improve in terms of the cardiovascular system from high intensity training? So things like increased stroke volume, etc.
Sure. So it's important to step back and separate what are often sport-specific measures from general cardiovascular measures or assessments. By which I mean, anybody who's been in the exercise space for a while might be familiar with the term, or coming from an endurance background, lactate threshold or ventilatory threshold or maximum aerobic function, or max speed endurance, or these sorts of measures. Those are all relative, or actually they're all specific to the task that's being performed. When we talk about cardiovascular health, when we look at the measure of VO2 or VO2 max, it's volume of oxygen consumed, that from that we can extrapolate through what's called the Fick equation, what is a central adaptation, that is the heart muscle itself, versus what is a peripheral adaptation, that would be tissue or organ level. And really you can think about this as there's the pump, pump is the heart, and then the delivery is, or the extraction from delivery is at the muscle tissue. Mm-hmm. Severely deconditioned individuals and high level athletes see the most value, or they see the long-term adaptation in changing the actual heart muscle itself. Now, just like metabolism, as we were talking about earlier, the middle of the pack, the people who are mediocre and improving, right? They're not sick, they're not elite, they're like you or I. We'll see changes in the heart muscle, certainly. But most of the adaptation in those of us who are weekend warrior athletes or just fitness-minded individuals comes from the extraction of oxygen in the working tissue and the improvement in the efficiency of the extraction of the oxygen in the working tissue, which is called AVO2 diff. So stepping back, VO2 is equal to heart rate times stroke volume, that's cardiac output, times AVO2 diff, which is the volume or the concentration of oxygen in arterial blood, the delivery, minus the oxygen that is in venous blood, which is returning to the heart. And so initially, when somebody is untrained or undertrained, they are extracting a very small amount, maybe 25% of the available oxygen from the blood that is actually making it to the muscle tissue. And this is due to a lot of localized or peripheral adaptations. So they lack the sufficient amount of enzymes necessary to deal with all of the cardiometabolic byproduct at the tissue level. So they're building up lactate faster, for example, even at relatively low intensities, and they can't deal with it. They quickly become anaerobic. They might have poor capillary density. That is the way in which you could imagine a freeway or a large highway in which is packed with cars, just full. It's rush hour. But unless you're training the muscle tissue itself that is contracting while you have a lot of cardiac output, you are not increasing the delivery of blood to that specific tissue. So as you train and start to force blood into the tissue, you can quickly outstrip the amount of capillary density you have in the muscles to take up oxygenated blood from central circulation, from that arterial circulation. And so a lot of those adaptations come from increasing capillary density, increasing mitochondrial density in the tissue, in the actual muscle cells themselves, the ability to deal with waste, the ability to take on pyruvate and turn it into energy in the mitochondria using the electron transport chain. These things are all peripheral. More than half of the adaptations you get cardiovascularly come in the periphery. And as you become more and more fit, the limitation starts to become delivery itself. So your heart muscle has to improve filling, the actual filling volume. The chamber needs to expand. The squeeze, the amount of stroke volume per beat increases. It increases because in untrained individuals, it levels off at a relatively low percentage of your VO2 max. But then as you get better, that number goes up. So the super elite are extracting huge amounts of oxygen, almost 90% of the available oxygen at the muscle that makes it to the muscle is being extracted for use. And so they need to get more blood to the muscle per unit of time, which is going to be a pump issue, versus you or I, which is just getting better at getting blood, oxygen out of the blood that's already there, is our great inefficiency. So whether that is with pure cardiorespiratory work or focused on more aerobic steady state kind of stuff, or high intensity interval training, or even HIIT resistance training, we see improvements to varying degrees as far as that's concerned. And the higher intensity training stuff, whether it's HIIT on a cycle ergometer or sprint kind of interval training, or the resistance training, certainly does improve that. And it's more effective per minute at doing that. But compared to so it's less effective per minute to do more steady state stuff, but you're doing more of it, right? It's a greater volume, and that's always the trade-off. So some people, and you will come to learn this with opening your own facility, Lawrence, is they go through the workout and they're clearly going to muscular fatigue. They clearly are reaching the point in which maximum effort is occurring. They cannot complete another repetition in good form. And you're moving them reasonably quickly from exercise to exercise. And when they're done, they're only mildly winded. And other people who are about the same condition and the same strength are gassed. They are breathing heavy. They need carpet time.
Why is that?
And so why is that? Some of that's going to be inherent aerobic conditioning. Some of that may be due to their lifestyle away from the gym. There is good evidence to demonstrate, actually 2 studies out of the University of Texas here over the past couple of years, looking at the creation of a degree of exercise resistance as a result of chronically being sedentary. So they did college students, and they had one group that was walking less than 4,000 steps a day and sitting something like 16 hours, or no, that's not right because they're sleeping 12 to 14 hours a day, mostly sitting, very little walking. And another group that was just walking all the time, more than 12,000 steps a day. The University of Texas is a large campus, so that should be a normal walking load for a freshman or a sophomore student. And then they had them do the same training intervention. And then the next morning, they had them drink a high-fat, high-sugar milkshake, and they drew blood looking at how quickly triglycerides were extracted as a result of that nutrition challenge. And the group that was sedentary before the exercise, or exceedingly sedentary before the exercise, they were something like 20% less effective at clearing the triglycerides as compared to the exercise group. And to make sure this wasn't just an artifact of who was doing it, they did a crossover design. So the group that was active became inactive, the group that was inactive became active, and they saw the same effect.
So which group exhibited the exhaustion when they did the training?
So what I would posit is that the people who are super duper sedentary and happen to maybe have a bad luck of the draw that their sort of resting VO2 max as a function of being an untrained human is on the lower side, are going to be more gassed because they're not getting as much sort of activity of daily living. Now, in the literature, you see as people get stronger, they want to do more. McGuff, Doug, talks about this as, global metabolic conditioning leading to sort of an expression of your ancestral evolutionary phenotype. Mm-hmm. And there's evidence of this in the literature, looking at postpartum women who, if they're doing steady state cardio or they're doing resistance training, what happens when you do resistance training, if they're wearing a pedometer, that's how they were measuring, you see them moving more over the course of the intervention. As they get stronger, they're doing more. So for some people, it's chicken, right? You strength train them and they start to do more. And in addition to the peripheral adaptations I just went into, they also move more, and it's sort of feed forward mechanism. They're getting more fit that way. And other individuals, you have to literally prescribe that they do more, because if you don't, they will do nothing. And those are the people who tend to be most gassed. Or I do know that some people who are my more aerobic clients, my runners, my cyclists, they initially aren't cardiovascularly challenged. But then as they get stronger and more capable as athletes, then they become cardiovascularly challenged.
Right.
To a significant, because it's almost like they become effective enough at driving themselves, and endurance athletes are really good about pushing themselves. So they do that, and lo and behold, they're winded again. But some of that has to do with the personality. Some of that has to do with the pre-existing health conditions. Some of that has to do with the structure of the actual training program to maximize cardiovascular work within our facilities, cool. Which we often talk about as a rush factor.
Yeah. So do you want to, that's obviously what we wanted to spend much of this podcast focused on. Rush factor is a bit of a controversial topic in HIIT because some people think it's completely redundant and there's no point in it. And others use it regularly in their training of clients. So let's talk about that. First, do you want to talk about, I guess, open this one up by saying, what is rush factor?
So the rush factor refers to typically you're trying to move people very quickly from machine to machine to maintain a high, both perceived exertion, right? You're not resting between the exercises, but also trying to maintain that high cardiovascular output, right? So when you're exercising on a piece of equipment, you're working hard, your heart rate's going up, trying to deliver more oxygenated blood to the working muscle tissue. You're having this vasodilation happening systemically. That means your arteries are dilating, your arterioles are dilating, your veins are loading up with more blood, you're moving more blood per beat. All these good things are happening, right?
AKA the pump.
The pump. Well, there's the pump. So that's the working muscle, right? In order to, some of that is you're loading more blood into the tissue. What I was talking about earlier, where if you don't get a pump in your arms when you run on a treadmill because you're not using your arms, even though as far as your heart is concerned, you are blowing out huge amounts of oxygenated blood. Only when you start training the tissue do the capillary beds or the arterioles open up and you start loading blood into that tissue and the pump, right? And since it's easier to get it, it's a little easier to get it in than it is to get it out. There's a long drag. Do lots of higher rep sets and you're going to blow up your guns, man. It's great. So the rush factor. So why do they do that? So on the positive side, if you're trying to drive cardiovascular improvements, that's one way to do it because it's continuous work. Where some people don't like it, and I think this has to do with where they are in their training career or their goals, is that as you are increasing this central fatigue, we would call it, right? Your heart is working harder, you're breathing heavier, then it becomes harder to actually get the higher order motor units recruited. That is, your strength is cut off a little bit because what we understand or what we assume is there's some evidence to demonstrate this as well. It's a brain adaptation. Your brain is saving that last highest order motor unit recruitment because if you're working that hard, something's wrong and you might still need a little kick to finish this off. And some of this is demonstrated. The BBC had a great documentary called The Truth About Exercise. And they did an interesting study in a altitude kind of tent where Dr. Mosley pedaled on a cycloergometer in low oxygen for some period of time. And then they put him on a knee extension dynamometer. And he is extending as hard as he could. And the exercise physiologist came around him with something called a transcranial magnetic probe and pinged him with it. And his force shot up from where it was, even though he's working as hard as he possibly could, before quickly reverting back to what it was. And the idea being that the transcranial magnetic probe sort of took the brakes off. It took the kid gloves off for just a second. And that delta, that difference, was seen as, if you're in a low oxygen environment, your brain is going to protect you from yourself because it wants to survive. And a lot of this kind of literature is in support of the central governor theory of resistance or strength training, whereby the central governor is your brain wants to keep you alive in the face of everything you want to do. So it's going to manifest fatigue, pain, discomfort to keep you from overexerting, given the circumstances, which include environmental factors that are in your life. And we could talk for 3 hours about that. But the short version is your brain is involved in making sure that you live another day. And so if you're centrally fatigued, there is definitely it is harder to get at those fast twitch fibers before you're tapping out, right? Before you're going, this is too hard. I'm stopping before the muscle could stop. I'm stopping because I am gassed. Okay. So if you want strength, then or focusing more on strength improvements over time, rest. That's a good thing to do. But if you're focused on general metabolic conditioning, then the rush factor allows you to sort of allows you to straddle. You can have one foot in the strength world because over time you're going to increase that load on the bar. You're going to increase the muscular work that's being done within a constrained unit of time. And on the other hand, you're going to drive substantial cardiovascular benefits. And a lot of this stuff, as we were talking offline before we got started here, is an extension of what's called peripheral heart action training. And this PHA, as they call it, it was developed by a physician in the late 1940s, and he had this idea that Arthur Steinhaus, and he had this idea that if you could constantly keep blood circulating during resistance training, then you could also drive cardiovascular benefits. And by peripheral heart action, he means that if you're training your legs, those contractions are forcing blood into the right side of your heart. And since it's forcing blood into the right side of your heart, it means it's forcing it back out into central circulation. Blood in equals blood out. It's a closed hydraulic system. And so the way in which this guy kind of structured or had the idea, I mean, it's the 1940s, the ways in which we could measure what was going on was relatively poor, but was that you would alternate upper body with lower body, which we often do as a management technique for strength on our next upper body exercise. But he was using a rush factor, getting between these exercises, 5 or 6 exercises performed, sequentially with the rush, alternating, but it's at a relatively medium intensity. And then going through them upper, lower, and then going through that 2 more times. So it was like proto-circuit training, but the idea being that you're using the upper body and the lower body and you're forcing a lot of this blood. It worked great kind of as using a rationale, but it had never been studied. A couple of years ago, there was a study comparing HIIT, high-intensity interval training, to this peripheral heart action training. And it's important to understand that when we say a medium intensity weight, they're talking like, 55% of their 1 rep max. They weren't going to fatigue. They weren't trying to do this in a kind of body by science, high intensity training kind of way. And what they found at the end of this intervention was that HIIT training did certainly increase high intensity interval training, increase VO2 max more than peripheral heart action training. But peripheral heart action training still increased the VO2 max by about 8% in this untrained population, which is not peanuts, by the way. That's a decent number considering that most individuals' VO2 max, unless they're severely deconditioned, can really only improve by, the literature suggests, 10 to 20%. It's like increasing the size of your cup by 10 to 20%.
So what did the HIIT do it by? What did they increase it by?
18%.
Okay.
18%, which is in the literature, like those higher intensity intervals. And let me see, the intervals were like let's see here.
But I guess again, you can't. It's hard to.
They were like
it's
1 minute
apples and
intervals.
pears, right? Because it's not high intensity strength training the way we.
Yeah. So again, it's kind of a bias in the sense that the HIIT group, I mean, it's apples and pears, right? But the point is that they got more out of it. Now, if you actually go down and look at some of the other measures of cardiovascular function, like systolic blood pressure improved more with the peripheral heart action training than it did with the HIIT training. That the baroreflex sensitivity improved, which is the rate at which, the cardiovascular, or excuse me, the rate at which your arteries and veins dilate and vasodilate or vasoconstrict in response to changes in blood chemistry, necessitating changes in, and also blood pressure, necessitating changes in the amount of blood you can move through a given area. So it was actually a very interesting thing because nobody had ever tested that. It had always been kind of rationally understood, well, if you're breathing heavy and you're doing work for long enough, then there's going to be a cardiovascular benefit. And of course, the PHA group got way stronger on all these exercises, and the HIIT training group got stronger in the legs, but nothing in the upper body because they weren't doing upper body work. So it's one of those things where how can you straddle? Well, you use the rush factor, and to make it a little bit better, you might also go upper body, lower body, upper body, lower body while doing the exercise, and you can drive substantial, significant cardiovascular improvements. It won't make you a marathoner. It won't make you a 5K runner. But your actual heart muscle and the extraction in the tissues will improve. So your cardiovascular conditioning, your general conditioning will improve.
So, okay, that's really interesting because I remember from reading the article you did with Simon that basically if you just do resistance training or high intensity training with, I guess, a short break in between exercises, but not in a rush factor format, then you're likely to be 60% or working at 60% of your maximum heart rate.
I said that's where stroke volume. That's about where stroke volume levels off, and so and that depends, right? But you will very rarely see individuals going up and above that. And I was, so I talked to Simon a while ago, and I'd done some research before that, and a lot of that came from like the residue of graduate school. Some of that being, if you're doing resistance training, the limitation is not going to be in the delivery of the blood. Like we talked about with earlier, you have the delivery side and you have the extraction side. Most of the adaptations that resistance training will drive is in the extraction side. You're doing hard work with muscle tissue. Your muscles are going to get better at extracting blood. And so as a result of that, there's not a need for your body to drive your heart rate up higher than that, assuming you're not trying to employ the rush factor. Once you try and employ the rush factor, you're driving up your heart rate as a function of aggressively loading blood back into the heart. So it's got to get it out faster, right? Mm-hmm. It's a closed hydraulic system. Whatever goes on the right side of the heart has to come out of the left side of the heart. And once you reach the limits of how much volume of blood you can pump out, then you have to increase the rate of heart. You have to increase the heart rate. You have to increase the rate of pumping. So that's how, if you employ a rush factor, you can drive a heart rate way higher. But it's largely as a function of driving blood back into the heart as opposed to outstripping the demand of the blood that's coming out of the heart.
Well, so just to, I'm sorry if I'm asking a silly question here, but just to clarify then, for those that are listening to this thinking, I still don't understand, and I'm one of those, why a rush factor may be more beneficial for cardiovascular health than regular high-intensity strength training, to compare those two things. Could you just clarify exactly what sort of differences one can expect in outcomes when doing rush factor versus, a standard high intensity strength training routine where they might be having a 1 or 2 minute break between exercises?
Okay. So acutely during the workout, you're going to expect that to be forced to use lighter weights later in the workout or accept lower time under loads later in the workout. In the middle to long term, if you have somebody with poor cardiovascular conditioning and they just keep harping on this, right? They want to feel out of breath. They want to have a near-death experience because that's kind of the currency of their understanding. As a client, they came from a cycling background or a running background and they want to feel out of breath because at the end of the day, 60% of your maximum heart rate is not like I can't talk. You're talking in full sentences. but your breathing is heavier. It's not a giant intensity. So the utilization of the rush factor could be, let's say, if you have no interest in doing, you just want to do one thing and your activities of daily living, and you see a client who is getting just gassed and destroyed, well, then your normal hit is probably sufficient. Their cardiovascular conditioning comes up. But if you have a client who told them that that this is cardio, that this affects your cardiovascular system and improves your cardiovascular conditioning, but they need to feel like they're having that training effect, that breathing heavy, that higher heart rate, then using the rush factor and using some of these kind of the structure in the training, kind of like the peripheral heart action does, will give them that acute feeling. And it might drive slightly more lab measured cardiovascular improvements, but that study hasn't been done. Like there's not a study that has been done that looks at, say, the way we set up an evidence-based kind of exercise HIIT group, which is already more work per unit of time, right? Because you're not unloading the muscles. The time and the loads tend to be longer. It tends to be the same as multiple accumulated sets versus, say, structuring it with a rush factor. I'm not aware of any. The closest thing we have is this peripheral heart action stuff, and it's using a lower load. So I could triangulate on this and we can go into the weeds, but I would like to see that study because the feeling of being gassed as the acute measure versus the long-term adaptation, I imagine they would be relatively similar in the long term, comparing normal hit versus potentially rush factor hit.
Cool. So now I get it now. So it's interesting because I can understand why some people just think it's, the more dogmatic people within HIIT think it's pointless and will never do it. But then there's the more flexible people who understand from a psychological point of view for the client, it might be beneficial. And as you said there, there's a bit of a unknown. We don't know if they are like for like in terms of like long-term outcomes, right?
Well, and think about this, was I was saying earlier about the multi-arm bandit. Some workouts you come in, Look, I've been training for my fitness career is 21 years old. I started lifting weights when I was 15. If I look back at my records, I'm not getting any stronger unless it's a new exercise, right? I mean, or a different version of the same exercise. So knowing that, unless I super specialize, right? Unless I go and become a power lifter. And then there's a lot of the skill conditioning, which is, like Jeremy Lenecke's idea around just doing 1 rep maxes, because it's even more specific skill conditioning for the performance that you're looking to measure.
Yeah.
So the working weights that I have, I'm sort of exist near the top of that, which is fantastic because you want the highest possible plateau. So that's pretty cool on one hand. On the other hand, so if I want to change the acute effect of my workout, and clients who've been with us for a while, 2 to 3 years typically, they're up on that shoulder anyway, right? So there's not a secret workout that's going to give them more gains. And in fact, there was just a study released. It's pretty fantastic. This is only a slight aside. I'm going to bring it back. It's not going to be a kind of a Skyler aside TM where I go off.
You've grown out of that, have you?
I'm just trying to be. You'll notice less ums and ams when you're reviewing this later.
I am very impressed already.
To stay on point. Here's the deal. There was a study that was done recently that was looking at within individual differences in training programs by training one limb one way and one limb another. So one limb in the legs were pretty straightforward progressive resistance training. 8 to 12 repetitions, and they could do more than 12. They increased the load. Very similar to classic Nautilus in that way, kind of Darden stuff. And the right limb, I think it was left and right, but the other limb, the other leg, did, undulating periodization, high rep days, low rep days, deloading days, And at the end of the training intervention, the results were basically the same because, as it turned out, both legs have the same genetics, right? But what was really interesting was that since they had a large cohort of people doing this, the between individual, that is the rate of response from one person to the next, was 40 times more variable than the within individual variability. So some people saw a minor improvement, so minor it is statistically significant, but it's not clinically significant, right? You can only measure it with ultrasound or biopsy, so it's real, but I can't tell. I can't look at my leg and tell that. I can't feel that. So James talked about this in a podcast where he talked about the clinically necessary, the amount of improvement that someone needs to see, and I think it was low back pain, to see an effect in their daily life. And that was a clinical significance. And when you're looking at training programs and you're saying things say, oh, this was better, but you actually look at the amount that was better, you wouldn't notice that.
Yeah.
And so they say about clinical changes are a difference is only a difference if it makes a difference. So unless that one leg that did undulating periodization, this and the other thing, wasn't like a half inch more girthy, you're not noticing that. And so the within individual difference, or the between individual difference, was 40 times more than the within individual difference, because people respond more or faster or differently to the same training program, whatever that training program is. So coming back to what we were talking about. So if you're
just to pause, I guess that would explain the Jay Vincents of the world.
Sure. I mean, Jay Vincent, it's not his turkey sandwiches that got him that big.
Really?
Wait, really? I know. No, I'm not picking on Jay, but that you see this in the longevity community. They're like, what did you do to live so long? Well, I don't smoke. I've kept my weight. I don't really drink very much. I sleep. I stay active. Yeah, but anything else you do? I occasionally put a little bit of scotch in my coffee. The headline is "Scotch and Coffee Let You Live Forever," right?
Yeah.
So Jay works hard, and he picked the right parents. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, everybody you saw it Rec. They're all capable of working really, really hard because they all do it on a regular basis, and yet you have wildly different phenotypes.
You do have very different bodies. It's very interesting. It's very cool. Yeah.
It is great. And so it's very cool. But bringing it back, so if you're quite conditioned, you've been at this a long time, then you can come in and say, okay, I'm not going to suddenly lose that strength because I'm not working with it today. And I might want to feel more cardiovascularly gassed. How could I reorganize the program that day to maybe make it a little bit more cardiovascular, because that's how I want to feel today? Or how can I want to feel more muscular strain? I want to do rest pause today. Or knowing that a 30 rep max and a 5 rep max, as far as hypertrophy concerned, as long as you get the maximum effort, basically have the same outcomes. And you're not feeling strong today, because some days you come in and you're like, son of a bitch, that weight, I'm just looking at it and it feels heavy and I've not even lifted it. Well, then go lighter and go longer and go more for the pump as long as you get the fatigue. So it offers you these variables that you can pull based on how you are feeling or the training effect that you want. And it still fits within that evidence-based framework. And you do this for your clients anyway. They walk in and they go, hey, I've got this work stressor. I've got this family stressor. I don't know if I have it today. So you lower the weight, they go longer to fatigue, you give them more rest in between the workout. You do that for your clients. You can do that for yourself too.
This is so interesting. And it reminds me of what Doug said to me years ago, Doug McGuff, on one of our first podcasts. He talked about how, I think it was, I could get this wrong, but I think he was talking about things like inroad, cardiovascular, stimulus, maybe load, maybe a few other things, as like almost like a Venn diagram, and how through your training career you should move the circle over various points of focus. Sorry, the dog's going crazy over something outside. So that you can focus on those for a short amount of time, maybe get more benefits in those areas. And obviously, if you're shooting through the middle, then you might be getting benefits in all areas at the same time, just not to the same effect. I mean, that's obviously maybe not the case. Who knows? But does that make sense? Kind of what I'm saying is that.
So what he is talking about: volume, frequency, and intensity.
It might be those three, actually. Yeah, and he might be. Yeah, that would probably make more sense. And he was talking about just moving the circle over each variable over the course of a training career, or maybe even more more frequently than that, in order
Absolutely.
to focus more on those outcomes. And I guess experiment, see where you may respond better. But obviously knowing that probably some of the recommendation we talk about on this show in the literature in terms of, high intensity training once or twice a week, I suppose twice a week for most people, with a routine that's like 5 to 10 exercises with a short break in between is like shooting a swish down the middle. You're still going to address all three of those variables, but then you may want to move towards the frequency section for a short while and maybe pick up the frequency to 3-4 times a week for a few weeks, see how that goes.
Well, and you're doing kind of the funny bit, right? Well, if you're still doing it, with the going towards a split routine is one way to manage training volume, and add more acute volume. But by moving to a split routine, if you're adding volume by necessity, you back off the relative intensity a little bit, because otherwise you can't do those later exercises, right? It's still high intensity, but it's all relative. Or for me, I've got this 25K that I'm running at the end of this month, and I've made gigantic gains in my running speed. I'm faster than I've ever been. I did a time trial last week, and I ran just a hair over a 5:30 mile. I've never come close to that.
Wow.
In the past. But I cannot keep up the training volume plus the training intensity, which is by necessity low frequency. So after this run, I'm just going to be kind of like maintaining based on objective performance, but it's still a really high plateau. And then maybe there'll be a race and I want to dive in and I'll back off the resistance training a little bit, not to zero. I'm always going to resistance train, but so you had there, these are all part of that Venn diagram of moving based on your goals. But the reality is, I don't owe the world any body fat as a result of getting faster, right? I'm still right at about 12% body fat. My calves aren't jumping off the back of my legs, my hamstring, so one of the challenges too is as we improve in fitness, we have this idea that's going to totally change us. And the reality is, if you've been doing this a long time, as you know, you're probably already there with your physique. And so you're just playing and kind of moving it around and keeping this interesting. Clarence Bass, who, our old man hit, he's always talking about challenge yourself, have opportunities to challenge yourself, and use this fitness built towards interesting things, but operate from that foundation of strength.
Yeah, that's wise words from the great Clarence Bass. Just aware of time, Skyler, and there's a few things I want to cover if we've got a few minutes. Is that okay?
We've got it.
Okay,
Let's do it.
Cool. I feel like you've really done a great job there in terms of talking about the rush factor, what it is, where it might be beneficial. I certainly think that what you said is very useful from the perspective of both the trainee and the trainer. And what I would suggest is for people that want to dig deeper, there's 2 articles that I will add to the blog post from Hit Uni, which are fantastic. One was a collaboration with Skyler, and the other one I think was James Steele. It just talks about, reading those should give you a fair ability to understand and then articulate the questions around cardio with your clients.
And I will also send you an article from a professor at the University of New Mexico who reviews that peripheral heart action training study and goes in kind of with a little commentary, and you can see the data at the very end. He sort of pulls out the table from the actual research article and makes it a little bit more digestible. Awesome.
That'd be great. And any other science that you can think of that will support this conversation is obviously very useful. And I'll link that up. So you've got some exciting news. You have been working on a course with Simon over at Hit Uni. Do you want to just give a bit of a preview?
Strength training and running, right? So
very relevant.
Right, it's pretty relevant, right? So I, growing up, the joke was, we've talked about this before, I played basketball and I was a high jumper. So I was good to run about 90 feet and jump. And that was it, right? My best mile in high school was like a 6:45, which is to say not good. But I could sprint hard and I could jump really, really high. And so my wife was a cross country runner. She's run some marathons. And as allowing yourself to be influenced by your spouse goes, eventually, once we had children, one of the ways in which we could spend time together here in Austin, we have the town lake, which is a river. Just go with it. So Town Lake has a trail around it. So we would go running on Town Lake Trail. And for some people, that's their church, man. They're there every weekend. They contribute to the greening and the development of that trail in a very positive way for the community. So I would push Jack, and then Jack and Liam, my two oldest. And then pretty soon I'll just still use the double bob. Jack will ride his bike. Liam and Henry will be in the double bob. But that was a way for us to spend time together. It wasn't about getting faster. And then I saw my specific cardiovascular endurance improving, and then we jumped into some fun runs. And next thing you know, I'm reading things from Andrew Magnus about utilizing high intensity interval training, kind of his application of the Menster idea around HIIT towards ultra endurance athletics. Some of the stuff from Aaron Olson, who wrote a book called Low Mileage Running. Some of the components from Brian McKenzie, who does Power Speed Endurance. PSE is his program, and other people. And just experimenting on myself and kind of coming to a place where I feel like I could take somebody from zero, because I was there recently. You know, like Andrew kind of came into the high intensity side of the equation, Andy Magnus, from a more traditional endurance background. I did not have the traditional endurance background, and so I'm coming from the other side of the equation. How do you start with strength training, and how do you build up from there if you want to start running? Not start running for health, but start running because, as you know, from doing some of these races and obstacle course races, so it's fun. How often as adults do we get time to actually have competition? And we tell our clients all the time, go get hurt doing something else with all the strength you have. And so I didn't have anything else I was using the strength for. So I wanted to do something else. And so at the end of this month, as I said earlier, I have a 25K, that's 15 and a half miles, a race out in the Texas Hill Country. The rolling is part of the Texas Hill Country. And it's the USA Track and Field 100K national championship as well. So you're going to see some people going really fast on trails. And I've done enough races now to know that there is a certain zen on a trail run where you have to pay attention to the now. You have to be focused on the now, because if you don't, you're going to clip a rock and you're going to eat it. You're going to fall. So being on a trail forces this 0 point now focus. That's real. It's a bit like being at the end of a set on a leg press, or when we're here in the gym, you can get very zen and very focused inward because it's all you can do to keep moving, right? It narrows your focus. And so these trail races offer that as well. And I find them fun. Do I think that they're going to do great things for my knees? Probably not. But I've largely mitigated a lot of that collateral damage by focusing on the intensity rather than the duration. And also, I don't have time. I have 3 kids. So I've improved my 45-minute pace by over a mile per hour in the past 6 months, which is huge, by the way, by focusing on intensity and no more than an hour a week of running. And now it's down to like 30 minutes a week, because I can't. Once you come in knowing what intensity feels like from the strength side, which I think is important, then you know how hard you can work, and it's really difficult to do anything halfway. And then you don't really look forward to it. So Andrew talks about this over the course of years, eventually whittling down to this number. And so what I'm trying to do is the opposite. I'm trying to take people with this foundation of strength, build up their running form, starting with skill, and then moving to specific strength exercises, and then improving their specific cardiovascular conditioning through intelligent high intensity interval training, some specific sprint work. But before that, just gradually building up the amount of time they're capable of running. So nothing magical, just kind of what I did. And the way I would have done it again had I not had to go through all the trial and error.
That sounds awesome. So, wow. So the course really does kind of lay out step by step, as you said there, the skills required to run effectively, and then a training program using kind of high intensity training and high intensity interval training to help, I guess, optimize someone's performance in a running event. Is that kind of
correct?
Yeah.
Given, yes. Will it turn somebody into an elite performer? No. Will you enjoy the gift of human flight? Yeah, a whole lot more than you did before. Because now I have 3 of them. My kids run everywhere. We ran everywhere. This was our prime form of locomotion. And so the ability to do that without injury, because that's been the best part about all of this in this getting faster and being fitter in that way than I've ever been, is I haven't gotten hurt doing it. Some of that is from the specific resistance training, and some of that is from the relatively small exposure to the actual training load given the intensity. So now I'm at a point where after this race, I'm just going to look to maintain the speed that I've built. And then, when there's a race I want to do, I know how to kind of tweak the routine. I set out some different routine templates that people can use and sort of pick and choose from. But that understanding of developing the skill of running first, and then building on the specific strength, and then extrapolate, and then building up from there for the specific endurance. We also go deeper into some of the cardiovascular stuff that we've talked about here, trying to set the foundation as to why there's plenty of CrossFitters who've gone out and done 100 miles or done 50 miles. They haven't done it very fast, and they will tell you it was miserable. So they clearly had the metabolic conditioning to support locomotion for that long. But had they added some specific training, they could have enjoyed it a little bit more. I'm trying to help people enjoy running more if they want to do something with all of this strength and less injury, given the time demands of their life. And also, I've really enjoyed, frankly, from a personal basis, the instructional design side of this. I've enjoyed it a lot. Because when I was at Efficient Exercise at the end of when I was there in the past few years, my effective job title was Director of Trainer Education. And so the opportunity to work on courses that don't require me to be in person and to improve my instructional design skills has really, it's filled my cup, actually. So the things I like most are, the one-on-one with clients, because I get to be very professorial. And then the instructional design is being professorial at scale.
Yeah.
So those are get me jazzed, man.
No, good for you. And no, it sounds really exciting. It sounds like it'll be a great course, a great product. And if you're interested in purchasing that course, it should be available in line with when this podcast is published, which will be, I believe, late October. And if you use the code HIB10, you should be able to get 10% off that course. Another thing I just want to mention is, Skyler, we were talking about you potentially doing a piece for the membership on getting things done. Do you want to just give a little preview on what inspired you to suggest that? Yeah,
absolutely. First of all, I wanted on my LinkedIn resume to have subject matter expert for high intensity business as a as a piece on there.
Of course.
And maybe a badge. But also, more seriously, literally, I just listened to Kyle, the COO of The Perfect Workout, talking about how the executive team operates remotely within their business. And Lawrence and Kyle were talking about getting things done. And Kyle was adamant about, really, you should try to use all of getting things done. And while that may be true and accurate, one of the challenges is, number one, it's a system of systems. And the education literature on habit change is that you can't do something like that piecemeal or full cloth. Most people can barely move. I mean, there's an entire book about this, like Atomic Habits, that the change needs to be so small that you think that the person giving you the habit thinks you're an idiot. That's how small it has to be in order to start to get traction. And then they build up over time, right? Mm-hmm. Or you have to have some sort of skin in the game. I think there was a book called The Blackmail Diet, either in the early 90s or early 80s, in which, the skin in the game was writing a check to some organization you hate and would abhor to be associated with. And you give that check to somebody else under the guise of, I'm going to lose X amount of weight by Y date, or else you're going to give that check to that organization and tell everybody that I donated to that organization. Blackmail, right? And if you do that, magically, people with skin in the game, they'll get it done. They'll find a way. So the idea of taking on a giant system of systems when all you have is maybe your one-on-one facility or you have one employee, that the question becomes, just like we talk about here, is the big three or the big five complete? No, but it covers a lot of ground as a training program. You get a lot of muscular work. You can drive cardiovascular adaptations. You can make substantial improvement. Similarly, the version that I've implemented, and that will go into how I've implemented it with no special tools, just what's available on a Mac, and I'm sure you could do it on a PC, is like the essential version of GTD. The things that are going to help make sure you are knocking out tasks, collecting tasks, focusing on the actual things that are going to move your business forward, and creating, in the fewest amount of steps possible, changes on the business, given your relatively small amount of time to work on the business, right? That's the other thing too. When you're training 6, 7, 8 hours a day, that makes it hard. And then you have family at home. It makes it hard to find time to do all of these other things on the business. So focusing on laser focus, what is the most important task today? Capturing everything in a ubiquitous capture, processing things if they're 2 minutes or less, and doing that. So I'll talk about GTD versus ZTD, and I'll kind of show the order of setup. And it'll be an opportunity, like I said to you offline, was to do a little bit more instructional design work. So hopefully these adults who are learning something because they want to, which is very different than children who are learning something because they have to, and it comes with a different set of skills, want to keep practicing those.
This sounds really exciting. What are the formats that you were talking about going to provide that in, do you think?
I'm going to build that in Camtasia. Mm-hmm. Camtasia is a way for me to film my screen, add effects,
right.
Build quizzes into it, and ways to interact with it. So that might be, or that's what I plan to build it in. And I need to dig in a little bit more into Camtasia to see how that would work with the architecture of the high intensity business. Because this is a tool that people use to build learning videos and do instructional design building all of the time. Yep. So I imagine whatever it's, the sort of the format it spits out into is going to be not quite omni-platform.
Yeah, we could figure that out. We could probably you could even host it somewhere, and then we could link to it, and then maybe create some kind of share connection, something like that.
Exactly.
But no, that sounds really cool, and obviously I'm ever so grateful for you doing that, and 100% up for it. And let me know if you need any help. And that's, so that will be available in the membership, obviously. And if people are interested in getting access to that, there will be a link in the show notes, but you can also go to highintensitybusiness.com/membership, and then please join the waiting list. You will also get access to blueprints for practically everything you need to understand and implement in your high intensity business. And there's also Q&As every month with people like Luke Carlson, Mike Petrella, Bill Crawford, the experts in here, where we basically give you the opportunity to ask these guys any question. So think of Luke, how much he might charge for an hour of his time. It's a fantastic service and an opportunity for you there. So for that being said, before I actually do leave the URL, Skyler, best way for people to find out more about you these days?
They can go to smartstrengthaustin.com. I mean, you're going to see a website that needs updating, but that's all right. You're going to see after the business is paid off. Or you can email me, Skyler, that's Skyler at smartstrengthaustin.com. I'm not on Twitter, not on Facebook. I'm sporadically on Instagram, mostly to share funny pictures of me from 21 years ago when I first got certified by Matt Hedman, that we found cleaning out a closet, things like that.
Wow. I was talking to Celeste the other day.
Celeste. Yes, yeah. Celeste.
Yeah, I had her on the podcast and we were talking about you. That will obviously be live by the time this is out.
You had Celeste on the podcast?
Yeah, she was amazing. Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. So Celeste is fantastic. Actually, Celeste had a lot of great... Celeste and I worked together under Coach. I mean, you can go on for ages, but she... Celeste is great people. She had this idea at the gym that we worked together. She had this idea where, to paint on the roof. She's like, let's look good naked on the roof. So that when planes see it, I'm like, Celeste, that's fantastic and hilarious, but who the hell's going to see that? She's like, I don't know, but that's what we're doing. We're selling looking better naked. I'm like, yeah, that's true. So Celeste is great people, hard worker, drove a T-Bird.
Yeah, because she and I met at the last Rec, so Rec 2019.
So Celeste was at Rec. See, I had a baby and I missed out on all this. This is great.
Well, I'm sure you'll be able to attend the one in the future, but yeah, she was there and she was just full of life and just looks unbelievable for her age. But credit to her, she's very quick to put a lot of that down to genetics, which is I think the difference in our industry is that I think more people tend to be quite honest about how big the role of genetics plays in their results. So that was nice to hear.
You're like, I'm going to have a follow-up course giving you the secrets of how I got so tall. And for just $199.99, I can tell you all of the things I did to become almost 6'3".
Yeah. Where do I order?
That's right. Where do I order? Push the button. Why? Take my money. But I mean, it's funny. Or maybe I'll follow up that with a course on how to get blue eyes.
Sounds good. And to all you people listening, to find the blog post for this episode, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/rush-factor. And for all episodes, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/podcast. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Discover how to achieve your health and fitness goals, become a great personal trainer, and build a successful high-intensity training business. Check out highintensitybusiness.com. highintensitybusiness.com.